Let's talk about the nutritional needs for a more active dog. Now, active dogs come in quite the range, meaning that we have kind of our more active pet dogs, which might get 2 30-minute walks a day, or maybe a hike every day for 60 minutes, or even a run twice daily. And then we have our service dogs that are going to be doing things with their owners throughout the day, where they're just standing on their feet for very long periods of the time. We also have our military or working dogs, which again may be doing a whole range of different activities, from sniffing to just walking around to actually helping with search and rescue. Then we have our canine athletes, which also come in a range from sprinters to endurance athletes. And then we have our really intense working dogs. So think of our sled dogs, our herding dogs that are literally on their feet running for 6 or more hours every day. So we can see this category of active dogs is pretty varied and has a wide range as far as how much activity these dogs are doing. But really, when we think about the nutritional needs for these more active dogs, we should be thinking about the energy expenditure of these dogs and then the energy utilization. But before we get too far into things, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Nikki. I'm a registered veterinary technician with a diploma in companion animal nutrition. And today I want to talk about your dog's nutritional needs. So to understand the nutritional needs for these more active dogs, we first need to understand kind of the range of activities and kind of how to break them down. Like, what is the difference between a sprinter and an endurance athlete? Obviously, there is a duration of activity, right? So the endurance athlete is going to have a longer duration of movement than the sprinter will, or the sprinter will have shorter durations, but maybe a higher frequency, whereas the endurance athlete will have a frequency of maybe once a day for the endurance activity, but the actual duration is going to be much longer. On top of that, we also want to look at how frequently the actual activity is performed. Are we doing it every single day of the week? Are we doing it every other day? Are there off days and on days? Are you only doing these activities on the weekend? And then also intensity. Obviously, the sprinter is going to have high intensity for short periods of time. Then we have our walking versus running. So 30 minutes of walking is going to be less intense than 30 minutes of running. Now, depending on these three factors, duration, frequency, and intensity, will depend on the energy expenditure and utilization. As far as energy needs go, really the two factors that we're going to be looking at is going to be duration and frequency. So for example, if you have a dog that is like a weekend warrior, meaning your dog might get little 15-minute walks during the week, and then on the weekend, you guys bust out a full-on hike, your dog's energy expenditure on a weekly basis is actually probably not going to change that much, because though you are doing a lot of activity on the weekend, overall, if we averaged it for that week, the activity actually isn't that much, right? Obviously, there's other things to consider here. Is if you do have a weekend warrior, you may actually want to have training sessions that build strength during the week, just in order to prevent injuries. And I'm not a rehab vet or rehabilitation strength training expert, but if you are interested in that information, I'll go ahead and leave some links below to some people I think that do cover that in really good detail on how to build strength for your dog that is a weekend warrior. But what I can tell you as far as caloric needs go, it matters what you do with your dog on a regular basis, not what your dog does once in a while, that's going to actually tell you what their caloric needs might be. So let's dive a little bit more into estimating caloric needs, or figuring out what your dog's caloric needs are. So all dogs have something called a resting energy requirement. This is also shortened to be RER. This is the amount of estimated calories that your dog needs in order to maintain basic body functions. So kind of your dog at rest is their RER. Now, we usually take that RER, and for active dogs or dogs on different life stages, we will multiply that by something called a K factor. Now, K factors range based on activity level and life stage. For the typical urban dog or the sprinter, we'll probably use a K factor of about 1.6 to 1.8. Now, this is what most pet food companies formulate their pet foods for. It's kind of the typical dog. And when you look at their feeding recommendations, that's usually based off of this number. Now, If you do have a canine athlete that's either a working or service dog, or you have a endurance athlete where we go RER and a K factor of maybe 2 to 4. And when we even get to our sled dogs, they can even go to a K factor of 6 or more in order to meet their caloric needs. Now, generally speaking, as duration and frequency increases, the amount of calories that are needed to maintain a healthy weight is also going to increase. But these values are honestly just estimates, and there are going to be some individual variation, and it is possible that your dog can actually be moderately to highly active and either have much higher caloric needs or significantly lower caloric needs than these estimated values. So if you do find that your dog is eating significantly less than what the bag or the product is recommending for the typical dog, then you might have a dog that actually struggles to maintain a healthy weight, in which case I would actually reference you to a video that I did before on inactive dog nutritional needs, because you're going to have to pay more attention to the calories consumed and the nutrient density of your diets in order to make sure nutritional needs are met for your active dog that actually maintains their weight well with less calories. So I'll link that above. Now, another way to kind of estimate to how many calories your dog consumes in order to maintain a healthy weight and to find out where they fall into this range is to actually just add up the calories that your dog is already consuming. If your dog is currently at a good body condition score, really what you can do is just add up all the calories that your dog is consuming from both their complete and balanced diet, along with treat, chews, additions, toppers, all that jazz. And you can see how many calories per day your dog is getting to see what their caloric needs are to maintain a healthy weight. Then you can compare that to kind of the estimated calculations that we went through earlier. And if you are significantly above or significantly below, you can kind of get an idea of if your dog fits into the moderately active category or if your dog actually fits into this more inactive dog category that I've been talking about. So let's talk a little bit about the macronutrient needs of a more active dog. So like I said, active dogs come in kind of this range, right? We have our sprinters, we have maybe our typical urban athletes that are maybe doing like longer hikes or longer walks. We have our service dogs, and then we have these endurance athletes. Generally speaking, what we know is that for our athletes, their caloric needs are going to outpace their nutrient needs, meaning that on a percentage basis, our dogs actually need more fat and carbohydrates within their diet than they do as far as protein. Protein levels are not going to increase as activity level increases because protein is a really poor energy source. We're mostly utilizing protein here for like muscle and tissue repair and then for blood volume, not necessarily in order to provide energy. And we look at kind of metabolism and how energy is utilized for dogs. We actually find that first, basically what happens is when the dog takes off, first utilize the glycogen within the tissues. So between the tissues, you will have glycogen stores. They use glycolysis to break down those glycogen stores in the first just couple of seconds of activity. So the sprinters or the beginning of endurance, they'll go ahead and use that glycogen. After that, they're going to go ahead and use carbohydrates as their main energy source. Then as duration continues at around the 60 to 90 minute mark, we're going to see fat oxidation actually take place of carbohydrates as the main energy source. So we can see for our athletes overall, as our duration actually progresses, our energy utilization as far as our macronutrients is going to change. And we see this reflected in our research as well. We have multiple research studies basically looking at our sprinting dogs, and they have overall just found that these dogs do best on diets that are kind of more moderate across the board. Moderate protein, moderate fat, moderate carbohydrates, because fat isn't quite utilized as their main basically fuel source at this time. So if you give them a diet that's too high in fat, they just have less ideal performance. Same if you give a diet that is too high in protein, again, performance is less ideal. So a moderate across the board kind of diet is what we're looking at for these sprinter athletes. Now, when we get into our kind of category of dogs where they're doing maybe 30 to maybe 60 minutes of activity in duration each day, that's when we start to get more fat content as being utilized as that energy source, mostly during that end of that activity level. So we want something that's moderate in protein, kind of higher in fat, and then a little bit more moderate to moderate low in carbohydrates. And again, we see this reflected in research mostly centered around hunting dogs, where they looked at both performance and also tissue injuries, where they found that these dogs did best on, again, that moderate protein, moderate high fat diet, and that moderate low carbohydrate. Now, when we get into our endurance athletes, we start to see our research kind of change. We have multiple research studies right now looking at sled dogs. And basically they looked at glycogen stores and how they respond to basically being on a really low carb diet, but being on really long durations of activity. So they found that these sled dogs that basically were fed a carbohydrate restrictive diet that was less than 15% carbohydrates, one, they had no ill effects as far as performance, and two, their glycogen stores actually remained steady after day 2. So they don't have this depletion of glycogen, even though they're being fed a low carbohydrate diet, meaning that maybe glycogen would be potentially lower. So for our endurance dogs, we're actually looking at a moderate to moderate low protein diet. Then we go to crazy high amounts of fat, and we can go carbohydrate restrictive. Now, there really aren't that many diets that fit the endurance athlete kind of area, mostly because Macronutrient profiles basically is appropriate for the moderately active to the sprinter athlete as far as its composition. When we start to getting into endurance athletes where they're getting these crazy amount of calories, we start to actually need diets that are lower than minimum values for AFCO in order to not exceed NRC or National Research Council maximums for things like vitamin A and copper and these other nutrients within the diet. Now, overall, we are looking on a macronutrient standpoint for as duration of activity goes up, fat content within the diet, we also want to go up, and carbohydrates within the diet will go down. Now, can you feed a sprinter athlete a higher fat diet? Sure, you can, especially if you do have like a pet dog that's just doing sprinting activities. Like if it's not time, does it really matter? Especially if your dog does really well on it and their skin and coat is good and their stools are good. Like I'm not gonna tell you no to doing that. And we do have some research, at least in people, that shows that basically when we do have these more high fat diets that are fed to these dogs, they will actually upregulate fat metabolism sooner. So they will actually shift kind of that chart that I showed you, and they will start with fat metabolism a lot quicker than if they were on a high carb diet, which is totally fine. Again, it just depends on what your dog does well on. Now, another thing that we really want to pay attention to for a more moderately active dogs has to do with digestibility and fiber content. So what you need to understand is that these dogs that are really active, their GI tract, as they move, something called peristalsis. So this is basically the little squeezing motions that causes food to move through the GI tract. So that actually speeds up when dogs are more active. So these dogs that are more active will actually be prone to having looser stools just because of the amount of activity that they're doing. You can couple this with the fact that a lot of these athletes or even service dogs, they'll be in really high stress environments, or they might be really excited all the time. The stress response or the excitement response will actually cause their GI tract to also speed up. So they're just overall going to be more prone to having loose stools. Now, how do we combat this in the active dog? One, we choose a diet that is highly digestible. So we are usually typically looking for diets that are over 85% digestible. I personally like looking for diets that are closer to that 90% mark because it's going to form that really small, compact stool. And it's going to make sure that all those nutrients that our dog needs are really actually being absorbed into their body, especially that fat and protein, which we know that we really need for both muscle repair and for energy. Now, the other thing that we need to look at is going to be fiber content. So typically with our more active dogs, we want to look for diets that are lower in fiber. So something around the 2% mark as far as crude fiber on a dry matter basis isn't a bad idea, just because it's going to make it so things don't speed through the digestive tract, because that crude fiber number is typically looking at insoluble fiber. And insoluble fiber is the thing that bulks up stools, and it's going to cause things to move faster through the GI tract. Now, for our dogs that are canine athletes, we actually want higher amounts of soluble fiber, which is going to slow down the GI tract, and then it's also going to cause a more compressed stool. So overall, what things are we looking at? For sprinter athletes, I want us to aim for diets that are between 65 to 75 grams per 1,000 kcals of protein. For fat, I want us to aim somewhere around 45 grams per 1,000 kcals of fat, and then carbohydrates around 75 or higher for carbohydrates per 1,000 kcals. Now, for our moderately active dogs, I want us to aim for, again, that 65 to 75 grams per 1,000 kcals of protein. Then I want for fat us to aim above 45 grams. So 45 to 55 grams per 1,000 kcals is, and then as far as carbohydrates, we can start dipping below that 75 grams per 1,000 kcals, because that's going to kind of offset to being higher in fat there, and we can kind of help with energy utilization. For our endurance athletes, our amount of protein per 1,000 kcals actually gets relatively low. Like I could go like 45 grams per 1,000 kcals, because again, they may consume 4 to 6 times the amount of calories that a typical dog would consume. So they're going to get plenty of protein. And then I want the fat content to really be shining here. So something well above like 60 grams per 1,000 kcals would be totally fine. Now, this is kind of asterisk here in the sense of some dogs don't tolerate that much fat. And this is where I want to kind of get into our exceptions, generally speaking. So for our active dog, though, as duration increases, we may want to prioritize fat over carbohydrates. If your dog doesn't tolerate high-fat diets, you don't feed a high-fat diet. You're going to feed a lower-fat diet, and then you're going to prioritize carbohydrates as your alternative energy source. Another common exception that I see for dogs that are in this category is that, yes, we do oftentimes want a lower amount of fiber in these diets. We want them to be highly digestible, but some dogs don't do well with that composition. Their GI tract just isn't made that way. It's not going to function that way. They need high amounts of fiber in order to basically have consistent, firm stools. If your dog is that dog, then don't force them into the highly digestible category. You may need a diet that's more moderate in carbohydrates. You may need to be adding fiber supplementation. That is totally normal. And I just discussed kind of these modifications with your veterinary team. If your dog doesn't have consistently formed stools, then talk to them about your options. Other things that you can consider for these more athletic dogs as far as nutraceuticals is that we probably want to consider some type of joint support. Many of these performance dog diets already have it within their diet, but you could always talk to your vet to see if you might need to add on more depending on what kind of activity that your dog's doing. 2, you may want to consider probiotic supplementation, especially if your dog is consistently in like a high stress environment. It may not go amiss to supplement probiotics. Again, this is something that's added to a lot of these performance dog diets. So you may or may not actually need to add that on, but it might not go amiss, especially since probiotics are so sensitive to like heat, temperature, storage. Having a probiotic supplement that is highly available and has good quality control and can be given to your dog on a regular basis that you can trust may not be a bad idea. So I hope that this general overview has helped you understand the nutritional needs of more active dogs. And next week, I'm going to go ahead and compare several different pet foods to show you kind of my thoughts on choosing diets for different types of activity levels of dogs and what I think. I'm probably going to split it up this time, do fresh food, 5 foods, and then do kibbles, 5 foods, just so that they're not all in one video because that last video was a little bit long. But if you have particular foods you'd like me to review in this category, go ahead and leave them below. Ideally, even link to the exact diet so I can make sure to include it. And I hope you guys have a lovely day.